Thank you, Jackie. Thank you all for being here. If you've just arrived, welcome, and I invite you to, if you haven't already, change your name, rename yourselves, indicate if you're a clergy or a delegate, and what church you might be representing. That would be great, so folks know where you're from. We'll be starting in just a minute.
How do you do that?
So you want to go into, you can go into your own individual box. In the top right corner, you'll see 3 dots. If you click on those 3 dots,
yep,
you'll come up with a small menu, and one of the options should be rename.
I'm on an iPad, and I can't remember how to do it on an iPad.
I'm also on an iPad. Thank you for saying that.
On an iPad, you click on the participants list and click your own name. And it should have 2 options, one of which is rename.
Oh, there it goes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Why does it say rename? It says Wendy's iPad, me.
Wendy, if you
Wendy,
click on your name, it should give you that option.
Okay, I got it.
Also, folks, if you need help with the Zoom meeting, there is a link in the chat. I'll put it again in the chat for you to go to a video to watch how if you need more help with Zoom features.
And I'll invite everybody to also just jump onto the chat and introduce yourself there.
And Elisa, would you like people to mute when they're not speaking?
Please. Just give folks another minute or so to get on and get their names typed in, introduce themselves in the chat.
Okay, so if you want to chat, this is where you would type. So you just click here if you want to chat. Oh, I have to mute you. Let me mute you first. Mute.
Hello, Julie.
Hi, Wendy. How are you today?
I'm good.
Good.
Jean Zamataro. So good to see you. Who else do I know?
Also know that you have an arrow because there's more. You can only see like 49 people in a gallery view. So you can swipe to the right to see more people, or click your arrow so you can see everybody who's here.
And right now we're up to 60 people.
Oh,
It's amazing.
that's
Wow.
a good crowd there. So can I just say, Wendy, I was muted, so I didn't get a chance to say hello to you. It's been a long time.
I was with you all morning, but you couldn't see me.
Right.
There is somebody else I know, Sue Church, Lynn McCurley. My goodness, it's Old Home Week. Sorry, I'll shut up.
Isn't that what annual meeting?
Believe me.
Isn't that what an annual meeting is? Old Home Week?
Yes, right.
So I think we're, in the interest of time, to make sure that we have enough time and to make sure folks get a little bit of a break between this discussion and the Peacemakers gathering, I think we'll get started. So I'm just going to invite everybody again to please introduce yourself in the chat. And please, if you're not speaking, if you could put yourself on mute, that will help a lot so that everybody can hear.
Yeah.
Wow, I am completely encouraged and blown away by the numbers that continue to climb here. We're at 73 people. I am really glad to see so many folks are interested in talking today. So I just want to start by letting you all know a little bit about how we ended up with this discussion today. If you had been paying attention to some of the plans for annual meeting, you might have seen that there had initially, at least last year, had been a panel that was planned for this time slot. And over the course of this year and transferring everything to this format, and after doing a little bit more of our own education, we felt like the format, this format in particular, would not have lent itself to the true spirit and nature of how we wanted to have that panel be.
What are the sessions?
So we decided instead to make it a time for us to share with each other some of the, I think somebody is not on mute, is that? Okay, there we go. We wanted to make it a time instead for people to be able to share a little bit about what their own exploration around racial justice, their own education around white supremacy has been. What are some of the resources that have been helpful to you? And I know there's been a lot of folks reading books, church communities reading books, individuals reading books, and books are great. But I'm also interested for us to really brainstorm and expand beyond just the books about what some of the resources are that we have it amongst ourselves in our immediate disposal in our state. And the goal of that, the eventual goal of that is we're trying to compile that list with the hope of sending it out conference-wide. So over this last couple of months, there has been a task force that has been created from the Justice and Witness Ministries of the conference called the Racial Justice Task Force. And we are looking at together the possibility of creating more conference-wide opportunities for education, for exposure, for activism together as a conference. So my hope again is that we can compile all these resources, whatever they may be, and just to give people an opportunity to talk a little bit about what that experience has been like for you. What have you learned that has surprised you? What have you remembered, perhaps that you knew before, but that has been brought to light again for you? Who have been your partners in this education, be it your church or maybe other members of the wider community? I'm also going to invite you that if you have specific resources, meaning titles of books, websites, etc., that you would please put them in the chat for us. And that's going to act as a record. And I will be able to save that later and again, comb through that, pile those resources together, and we'll be able to send them out conference-wide. So with that, I just want to make two other small announcements. One is the Reverend Lisa Sparrow, my predecessor at Guilford Community Church, is on the Religious Affairs Committee of the NAACP of Windham County. So if you are in the southern part of the state, they are looking for more members of that Religious Affairs Committee. So please be in touch with me. I can get you in touch with her if you're interested in that. And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I believe I saw Debbie Ingram here. Debbie, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Debbie,
Lisa. Hi.
Could you talk a little bit about what VIA is doing around racial justice education for us?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much for calling on me, because I was just trying to write something in the chat. So thank you. Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Debbie Ingram, the Executive Director of Vermont Interfaith Action. And we have some what we call organizing committees. So they're kind of working groups that are very active looking at particular issues and trying to make impact on those around dismantling systemic racism. So there are three opportunities there. One of them is focusing on economic opportunities as they pertain to businesses. One of them is on economic opportunities as they pertain to housing and land ownership. And another one is about reimagining public safety. And those three groups are active now, and I'd be very happy for anybody to inquire about those and potentially join them, or if we have a lot of interest, we could kind of splinter off into different regions of the state as well. And then we also, for folks who are white folks who are still kind of getting their feet wet in terms of what it means to be a white ally, and to set you on your path to liberation, and to be a true anti-racist. We're offering discussion groups. So there'll be one that's kind of a book study, sort of a beginner level, that Marjorie McNeil and Lee McCaffrey are going to be leading. And that'll start in May. And then that will also run in the fall, and then next January. And then for sort of an intermediate level, I and my staff colleagues are running one that's, it's a 4-part workshop that really dives into how you can be a very active anti-racist ally. Again, I'm very happy to have anybody inquire about that. I'll put our website in the chat, and would love to have lots of folks join in some of those activities. Thank you, Elisa.
Thank you, Debbie. Sorry I put you on the spot, but
No,
I figure
not at all.
you're pretty used to jumping up and talking about all the great work VIA is doing. So thank you.
Talk all the time. Yes. Thank you.
So who would like to start us off? I ask that you would use the raise your hand function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen in the reactions. And I will do the very best I can to see you and call on you. What has opened you up? What has opened your eyes to things you hadn't seen before? What resources are you finding helpful in this journey to becoming an anti-racist? Catherine Kidder. Please unmute yourself. And if you would like to put your camera on, you don't have to, but go ahead and unmute yourself.
Sorry, that was a mistake.
Oh, okay. Good to hear from you.
Thank you, you too.
Eleanor. Please unmute yourself, Eleanor, so we can all hear you. There you go.
Eleanor Zhu from the First Congregational Church in Thetford. I just wanted to give a little background from the past. In about 1998 or 9, out of the mission department, we had a uprooting racism task force for 10 years with John LaRue was the organizer, Helen Jean Reindell of, I believe, Bethany Montpelier. And we deeply studied our own racism, and yet found that there's a lot more to know. I know we talked about reparations, we went to talks, we had speakers, and we had workshops, but there wasn't a lot of receptivity at the time. I'm just reflecting that we've come a long way, and I still am working on it. It's not a thing one totally understands. That's mine.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you for giving us a little bit of history within the conference of some of the work. Much appreciated. Other folks? Resources that opened you up or experiences? I see, Dawn, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have a raised hand under reactions.
Okay.
I'm in seminary in Chicago. I'm learning what it's like to be one of the minorities, because I am, as a white, privileged female in my 70s, I don't fit with any of the other people in my classes. And they are just so wonderful and teaching me. Most of the resources that are on the side over here under read these resources came from them. There's one on how to be an ally. There's a whole bunch of videos. I didn't dare put them in because I know that the conference has been nailed in the past for breaking copyright. So they're all just listed. That's it.
Thank you, Dawn.
Yeah.
Susie, I see your hand.
Yeah, thank you. Susie Webster Tolino. I'm in Westminster West. I'm in Brattleboro. I serve in Westminster West. One thing that was a real delight in my congregation this summer, not long after the George Floyd murder, was we had a group of people who met by Zoom to discuss my grandmother's hands. And it was led by a young woman who is not part of our congregation, who is Jewish in background and Buddhist in practice currently, and is loosely related to a couple members of my church. And one of the wonderful things about that was it included church members and non-church members, because she just approached me and said, would it be okay if we talked about this? She had been in Minneapolis for the previous few years, and had been something of I guess you'd say, disciple is a slightly too strong a word, but maybe not too much, of Resma Menakem, and had learned from him directly, and just had done a lot of work about kind of interrupting her own whiteness, her own white privilege. And that's a really good book discussion group, and it worked very well in a I guess you would say sort of a mixed group, in that it was not all church folk. The other thing I'll say is I'm so glad that all this stuff is in the chat, and I cannot multitask at all, like ever in life. I'm bad at it. So I really can't read all those. Did you say that those will be somehow disseminated, captured? And
yes, my plan
Good.
is to take them and capture them and then distill them down to one long list that we put up hopefully in the conference website, et cetera, and disseminated.
Perfect.
So
That's
no
great.
need to multitask today.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Julie, I saw your hand up.
On race.
Yes, I'm looking up what I wanted to tell you about. I watched
I'm gonna get a
a
water. You
group
want one?
or
No, I'm good,
discussion
thank you.
on Zoom from the UCC, Yvonne Delk. And she had a discussion on the fifth church regarding when the UCC was formed. We know there were evangelicals and but we didn't know that there was an Afro-Christian component to all that. And I found that amazing. So she went on to tell about different, the Afro-Christian church, which is something I never heard of. Maybe some of you had.
So some history that you hadn't known before that kind of opened you up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I used to work in the national office, and I never heard anybody talk about the fifth group.
Thank you for bringing that to our attention, Julie. I saw Tracy and then Laura.
Hi everyone, I'm Tracy Weatherhawk. I'm serving the Paulette Community Church, and we had talked for a long time, and I've been trying to connect with the Paulette Community Library about doing a book study, and it's taken until just this last month for us to do it, but it's been really, we'd met just one time and we'll meet a second time. We're reading a memoir, Waking Up White, which I think is a pretty easy book to kind of get into the subject. So I'm anxious to hear what people might like to do and follow up, but we're doing that. And I was actually had my camera off because I was eating my lunch, because from 12 to 1, I was part of a group. I put in the chat the Food Solutions New England 21-day challenge. I've done it for a couple years. My daughter had turned me on to it a couple years ago, which for 21 days, you're sent all kinds of information. It's amazing information, so good. Overwhelming is my theme every week. I just say it's just so overwhelming. There's so much to take in, but lots of good resources. And so I would highly recommend that as well. And it was interesting going to that, having just heard Tracy speak. It was just kind of like, oh my goodness, there's just, it's great to have all of those things kind of coming together. But I think the more I learn and the more I understand that I don't know, the more overwhelmed I get in terms of just the systemic deep roots of all of this, and just wondering how can we ever get out from underneath it. But I'm hopeful that when there are 103 people here to talk about how they're working on it, that we'll get there maybe eventually, or we'll keep working on it at least. So, so thank you all for all that you're doing.
Indeed. Thanks, Tracy. Laura, good to have you with us.
Yeah, sorry, I had to find my way to the meeting. I think part of the question, right, is what experiences kind of opened us up. Yeah. So for me, it's funny, like I left Vermont and came back to Vermont, but like it was my experience here in Vermont as a graduate student. I really started to get a sense of what it meant to be a white person and how that was different. And part of that was being in relationship with my colleagues, and both going to the store to buy materials for our program kind of thing that we were doing. And we were both from out of state, right? I was white, she's black. I went up to pay and I had my new check from Key Bank. I think it was Key Bank at the time, right? Back in the day. It was taken, no problem. Khalees, she had to show not one form of ID, but 2 forms of ID to try and make that happen, right? And other things. And, over time realizing that at the time, like I could go out dressed, wake and roll. I was never a big high fashion person, right? I could just walk and roll and go out to downtown Burlington to go across campus. And she would talk about, she couldn't do that, right? Because she wasn't seen as an individual. It was a collective vindication of her race, of whether or not she was really supposed to be here, whether she really belonged here or was an asset to the community, right? So there were ways that both experiential, but also systemic, that impacted our ability to do our jobs and to just live and to work in Burlington that were directly related to race. And so part of it was being in relationship and listening and noticing, right? That my experience of the world was not the same. And being able to sit with that discomfort and not try and explain that away. Yeah.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for sharing that experience. And I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing that many of us have had some experience that stands out in our minds, that led us to kind of our eyes being more open to what was actually going on in front of us. Other folks? Dawn, I see your hand again. Go ahead. You have to unmute though, so we can all hear you.
Some 20 years ago when I worked in the emergency room, the house staff used to come down and stop on their way to bed so that they knew what was there and what they might be potentially woken up for. And there was our chief surgical resident was a Black woman, and she was brilliant. But she would come down and talk about things that patients would say to her. She said, patients would ask me if I could dance, if they could touch my hair, how was I at singing? And I said, well, doesn't that make you mad? And she says, no, these are people who've never experienced this before. And I'm trying to be nice to them. She says, the one that makes me mad is the chief surgeon who had diplomas all over his walls from all the places he had worked at. And he told her that he was going to plant her a row of watermelon in his garden that next summer. Like it was just an ignorance there. Just
wow. Yep. And how do we stay present when we're hearing something like that?
Yeah.
And like Laura was saying, not just dismiss it or step away from it, which is easy to do sometimes when you're in the midst of something painful. Thank you. Jeremy, I see your hand.
Hey, everybody. It's so wonderful to be here at annual meeting with you all. What a gift to be able to be here together in this new way. I would just say that, the stories that I've heard is that, my understanding is that, it's relationships with other people that open people's minds. And so I think that, being in a state or being in churches that are predominantly, homogenous, more homogenous than other areas, I would just say that that is the challenge that I'm looking to so many of you during this weekend to figure out what to do. And book groups are great if people want to read, because then, especially if you start with something like Just Mercy or one of these other more narrative, My Grandmother's Hands, something that's more about someone's life experience, get someone into a story. I love videos that do that sort of thing. But I think that, when I, like yesterday, without going into details, I just came straight up against kind of MAGA, Trumpian white supremacy. And I was appealed to, the person thought that I was a safe person to share this with because of the way that I appear to him. And, there's an activist part of me that wants to destroy that guy, his ego or whatever, and embarrass him in front of his coworkers. But then there's this pastor part of me that feels like this is where I'm an evangelist. And so what I'm wanting to hear from all of you or learn from this weekend in part is just how do we make for those of us who are allies or trying to be allies, how do we try more and more to choose the option, because for us as an option to somehow represent people that are in oppressed categories in those moments. And I guess just more subtly and simply, like, how, in church, what does work for experiencing relationship if we do not have, Black and brown congregants or to help direct our work. I have some answers to that, but I'm interested in other people's answers. Thanks.
So Jeremy, if I can try to paraphrase what you said, I heard two questions. The first question I heard is how can we act as allies, true allies, or true accomplices is how I choose to name it, in moments where we're directly faced with racism. And then the other is, how do we, as a predominantly white denomination in a predominantly white church, how do we thank you very much, develop those relationships? How do we make those connections? So I guess I will just, did I get that fairly right, Jeremy? Okay, thank you. So I'll just open it up. If anybody has any response or thoughts, questions? Yeah, go ahead, Abigail.
So I have a related question, I think, rather than an answer. So this last week I was sitting with a member of our community, a Black woman who wanted to share that she had had an encounter 3 years ago with the Vermont State Police that went very wrong. And after trying to bring that through the channels within the police, brought it to the Vermont Human Rights Commission, and it was found to be discrimination. And she said what was most painful about this is that for those 3 years that this case was ongoing, she couldn't share with any of her white neighbors what had happened, she felt. And this was a person who was born in Vermont, grew up in Vermont, and is well embedded in the community, but said she didn't think that she would be believed because people didn't have context. If you say the police did something to me, it sounds so crazy. And her question to me was, I know this happens all the time, and how can we how can we make it safe enough for Black and brown people to tell their neighbors when these things happen? That was the start that she wanted. How could it be safe enough that I could tell my neighbors and not feel further endangered? And she wanted faith communities to have that conversation. And I know many of us, we do have a problem with just knowing Black and brown people in our communities, but we will know more because they're here. And so the next question is, how can we recognize that we are not the same? And how can we be safe enough that they could speak about these things? So that's the question I bring today.
Yeah. Thank you, Abigail. That's a really powerful question. Very powerful question. Anybody want to respond to any of the questions we have on the floor, including?
I would like to respond just to let you know that Catherine Kidder, maybe she's already talked, but has had her hand up for a while.
Yeah, no, I think that was I called on her first, and I think she said that was a mistake.
Oh, gotcha.
If that's not true, Catherine, please jump in.
Still a mistake.
Okay. Good enough. So I'm just going to make an observation that when we moved from talking about books and other such resources to kind of some more deeper stuff, that got a little quiet in here, even with 102 people. And just make that observation, not as a judgment at all, but just for us to really, let's start doing the work right now, right? Tom, I see your hand, go ahead.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to follow up on something that Eleanor Zhu said about not having the Uprooting Racism Task Force, not having, I don't know how she put it, but much of an impact. I had the privilege of watching Eleanor and many of her colleagues do that work, and I think it was quite impactful. Maybe not as much as any of us would wish, but it was really a great effort, and by many, and deserves to be remembered and emulated. And one of the things that it taught me was, and I've seen it in Stratford as well, is that to have an organization in town and for the church to be part of it that is working on these issues is really important, because when the moment comes, and it will come, when there is an incident, then you are in a position to be an ally and to bring resources, information, to stand with, to move quickly. So it could start as a book group, but to keep your eye out for incidents and people with whom you can stand. And the Uprooting Racism Task Force was there when there was a child in our school system who had been had a racial kind of an attack, and we were able to bring resources to have a meeting with concerned people, thanks to the existing group in the conference. Similarly, our church helped found a town group in Stratford, and there was a racist comment made by a town official, and we were able to to act quickly, to create to work with the select board to put policies in place, to address that. So it may have gotten quiet when we moved from book group to to talking about action, but and it may be quiet for a while, but the time will come, if you're there, when you'll be able to act, and that will be transformative.
Thank you, Tom. So a little bit of what I heard from what you said also is to be working on developing those relationships, especially with organizations in your community who are doing the work on a regular daily basis, so that when something happens, there's already a relationship there and there's a way to kind of support and move forward. So that's a good resource as well. Wendy, I saw your hand up. Did you have something you wanted to share?
Yes, I'm going to be sharing more during the Peacekeepers event, but I'm connected with a group, several groups in Vermont doing asylum seekers hosting and work. And so a lot of the people I have been connected with in my community are not African Americans, but rather folks from Central America. I have semi-adopted a couple from Nicaragua. And one of their problems is that their English is not brilliant. They grew up speaking English Creole, which means they appear to be speaking English, but they're really not. And he especially has had trouble at work with people sort of, I would call it bullying. And I said to him, why have you not spoken to your supervisor? He said, he says he can't understand me. That is not true. You know, he really is intelligible if you bother to listen. So I think what I'm saying is that if you come across people, which we will more and more, who are from Central and South America, whose accents are different, to really be aware that you have to take the time to really listen and see and be an advocate. And I think that as more of them come here, especially asylum seekers, hopefully, that we will need to be walking with them and supporting them. And the fact that there are 5 different groups in Vermont working on this project, we have already got associations that are working on it. Just a side to that is when our group started, there was a parallel group that were working on supporting people who were already here of diverse nations. And we had a big event, like a big picnic thing, which really worked very nicely. So, I mean, I think there are lots of different small things you can do so that, as the previous speaker said, when something does come up, they know they have allies and supporters in the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. And thank you for calling into this circle. Folks from Central and South America many are still at the border in detentions. We tend to, there's so much been going on, right? We tend to forget that's still true. I wanted to lift up something that I saw come through the chat. Rob, you had mentioned about the whole idea of bearing witness, which is a very Christian kind of ideal, right? Bearing witness, and talked about, what would it be like if you saw a person of color being pulled over and you decided to stop and just be there to bear witness. And I think that that's a very powerful way to be an ally. But I would invite you to really think about that also, not just as so passive, but that there could be other roles you could play. I watched a video this morning. The author and activist Stacey Ann Chin, she's a writer, predominantly a poet that writes a lot about racial justice in our country, posted a video this morning of Black woman who was sitting in the street in Minneapolis. This was last week before the verdict came down on George Floyd's murder. And there were people just standing around. There was a number of police officers on the scene who were trying to get her off the ground, basically. And there were a number of people standing around just videotaping her. And gratefully, another Black woman, social worker, came along and sat with her and was asking why the people were just standing around videotaping. So for me personally, it drew my attention to what might be the next level of allyship in a situation such as that. So I just share that with you because I saw what Rob had put in the chat, and it was a moment for me of thinking deeper about what it means to be an ally. I see Julie and I see Abigail. Julie, go ahead.
I have two comments. One, I really appreciate the acknowledging that racists are not born. They are made. I grew up in an area in south of Cleveland that was mixed, and I didn't know there was a problem until somebody made it up for me. So that's really, and therefore, what can we do with our schools is my point. The second thing is, what do any of you know about the situation in Rutland, where the black woman who was leader of the NAACP there had to leave town because she and her children were threatened? And I think that's unconscionable. And it's easy for me to sit here and say, everybody stood by and did nothing, but I don't know that that's true. Obviously, there are people who may have started it, nobody came to her rescue.
Yes. Chris, I see your hand, and Sally Mae, I understand that you had your hand up too. So Chris, if you could go, and then Sally Mae, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to Julie's question about Tabitha Pull-Moore, who was the former director of the Rutland area NAACP. So she lives in my town, Wallingford. Her daughter was a schoolmate of my daughter. My daughter's a junior, she's a senior. Reese, the daughter, had made a proposal to the school board for the raising of the Black Lives Matter flag. It was a very thoughtful and well presented proposal. And the school board voted unanimously not only to raise the Black Lives Matter flag, but also the rainbow flag, and not just at the high school, but all the schools. And the response from some of the community members was so racist and threatening to not Tabitha, the mom, but to Reese, the daughter, that Tabitha felt that it was no longer safe for them to live in Wallingford and they had to leave. I will say that while the racists were perhaps had the loudest speaker in the room, so to speak, that a lot of allies came to the fore and supported Tabitha and Reese and vocally and out into the public, including my daughter, who is actually working on a project right now with Vermont Digger on a series of articles about this very thing. But unfortunately, you know, racism is present not just in Wallingford, unfortunately, but I believe in all of our communities. We just don't see it all. It's not very visible. And we don't, as being people of privilege, we don't have the lens to see it until it is, you know, like George Floyd's murder put right before our eyes in very stark terms. And so, and this is why I think the silence was there when we started talking about it. It's our work, even if we don't call ourselves racist and we don't think of ourselves as white supremacists, it's our work to work on our lenses every day and ask ourselves, is what we think we're seeing really what is out there, or are we only seeing what our own lenses are telling us and really checking ourselves all the time. And that's really, really difficult work, and it's hard to put into and articulate all the time. But even when you're driving down the road and you see a person of color or someone who looks other than you, what are the reactions that, you know, your body has? It's different than when you see someone who looks like you, you know, and we need to really do that tough work and understand where that's coming from. And it goes back generations, and it's been passed down to us in ways that are beyond words. And so it's going to take generations and work that is beyond words.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for giving folks also a little more context and the situation with Tabitha and her daughter. Appreciate that. Sally Mae, did you want to jump in here?
I'm backtracking a little bit, and that's why I kind of wanted to get the question. And it's actually to Wendy. And I wonder if you have offered to go with your friend to his employer to talk with him directly, to be an ally for him. I just wondered if that was an option that you had offered him.
Yes, absolutely, I offered, but he said, well, not now. We'll see how it goes. Absolutely. I offered to do various things like that with him.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I was just curious. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Michelle, I see your hand.
Yes, thanks. I wanted to jump with the perspective of schools, because I'm a teacher at Woodstock Union High School. I live here in Rutland. And schools are all really jumping on this now. My school is developing an anti-racist policy, working with some African-American lawyers to do that. I think most schools are doing that, but as Chris said, it's a long battle. And the first comes for ourselves, looking at our privilege, those of us who are white. But I'm facing battles in my own school, not with my school, but with some of the parents. I'm currently in an African-American experience unit, and I did an activity on privilege this week, and immediately got an email saying, was I trying to indoctrinate the kids, because I used myself as an example of my own awareness, growing awareness of my privilege. This is going, Chris is right, it's going to be generations of work, sadly, but I think it really is starting to happen. And I think we have to be brave. And even though we're going to make mistakes, and I know I'm making some of my classes and how to do this, we have to do it. And I think people are getting ready, but you have to do your own work first to have the courage to try to do it in other spheres. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that. And it's wonderful to think about maybe perhaps your church family, your church setting being the place that you can bring some of this in the other parts of your life in terms of process and support. That's a great thing. And I'm glad to hear that more schools are actually starting to engage in this work. That's great news. I see Kurt and Wendy and Kim.
I really appreciate the conversation and appreciate the last comment about it'll take generations, because it's taken generations. So one of the questions that I've been thinking about for the last couple of years, which I'm curious to hear people, at some point talk about, is how do we keep our eye on the many balls in the air? So how do we do eco-justice and anti-racism work? And I was in a conference last week with Middle Church, New York, 4 days. It was stunning and beautiful and wonderful and engaging. And climate crisis wasn't mentioned once. I don't fault the conference for that, or that conference for it. but it's just, how do you keep without getting burnt, multitasking? I mean, that's even more than keeping an eye on the chat and being on Zoom at the same time, So I wonder about the deeper core issues. And, I was taught to look for clues. And so one clue that I heard was Tracy Blackman saying something that I'd heard last week about this understanding of colonization, of the document of discovery being church sanctioned. And that notion of manifest destiny. And I think that I've been thinking, and I'm curious, like how do you do those many things? And I wonder about that being one of the roots, is this notion that we are making a killing as a mark of success, and as church, what our unique offering is to this reparative work, of understanding ourselves as guests, who don't own slaves, who don't hire hirelings, who, get dirty. And anyway, without getting preachy about it, I'm just curious about the ways that we might be able to engage all of these issues from our Christian seat on Abenaki land. So
another excellent question. And I don't know if perhaps people who have put questions out would put those in the chat as well. I know it might be hard to try to capture something like that, but some version of them, because I think that's important, because these are things that we're thinking about across the conference. So it'd be great to be able to kind of look at ways we could address them conference-wide as well. Kim, I'm going to call on you because you haven't had a chance to speak yet. So please go ahead.
Sure, thanks. I just wanted to let you know that Bethany Church in Randolph and Old South Church in Windsor are collaborating now on a 3-part series on Christian nationalism, kind of a different angle, an important subset of the conversation, and learning that, Christian nationalism is wrapped up in patriotism and in white supremacy. And we took kind of a 3-pronged approach and did the deep dive into colonialism, and now last week talked about what's going on now, and then next week we're going to talk about what now. So we're learning, but we're also trying to come up with some concrete steps that we might do, and realizing that it needs to start in our own hearts, in our own families, and in our own churches. So we're having a really good, important conversation.
Thank you for that. And it is a little bit of a different angle, but still intersects with a lot of the stuff we're talking about very much. Somebody had written, Chris, I think, wrote in the chat, if you have spoken already and you don't intend to speak again, if you could lower your hand, that way I know to not call on you. That would be great. Thanks. I'm going to go to Fred and then Abigail, if you have something you want to add.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Kurt really mentioned this sort of in passing, but and the Reverend Blackman also. But one of the things I mentioned, the podcast Seeing White earlier on in the chat, that I learned about through the VIA training, and he has some great. The first 3 or 4 podcasts really talk about the history of racism being constructed, because it was an economic it was they needed workers to fuel the economy, and I think that, Kurt, seems to me the tying element here is the climate change is based on us using having the economy that is a consumption economy. And, you know, all of these things are you know, and the whole disparity in wealth, you know, the huge amount of wealth owned by a tiny group of people. And you know, I think that's probably that's what I'm coming to learn is the binding force of all these issues of injustice.
That's exactly the crux of intersectionality, right? You know, where is the place where what's happening with the climate intersects with economics, education, on and on and on. I think we're just at the beginning parts of really starting to understand how climate change has affected people of color, for example. I mean, I think we could probably name a few things, but I think we're really just starting to understand those connections. I see Alyssa May and I see Ed. And Abigail, did you want to have something else you wanted to add? Go ahead and jump in.
Thank you. I really appreciated Kurt and others bringing what is the particular lens of the church in this conversation. And one I think we could bring is that we, our spiritual traditions, our faith embraces transgressive people who are viewed as not following the rules, that our spiritual ancestors didn't follow the rules of the empire. And I think that's important because and this is something we can talk about in our book groups and really prepare people for when the incident comes. I think it was Tom who said, it's really good to have a group that's talking. So when the incident comes, you're prepared. When the incident comes, it is always justified as being the fault of the person who is discriminated against. And usually there is something that people can hang the discrimination on. It was a child who was acting out in school and the discipline was not excessive, or it was someone who was speeding. It was someone who didn't stop when the police turned on the flashing lights. There's always a reason. And I think when this happens in a community, the conversation always comes to, in my observation, everybody wants to be fair because communities know both people in this interaction and they want to believe in the good. And they think that if you're racist, you can't be good, right? So we have to break down that. But it comes down to, well, what did you do that this happened? That's the conversation I hear over and over, which is a lot like the sexual harassment conversation. How did you bring this on? Because it wouldn't have happened if there wasn't something. So I think knowing that that is always how it will play out, to prepare ourselves for that in these conversations and to have a spiritual lens to look at that to understand, to think about, we know that people who are blamed for doing wrong are not always in the wrong. That having some of those conversations ahead can help us be ready.
Thank you, Abigail. Alyssa May.
Was Kim ahead of me?
Kim, your hand is still up. Do you have something else you want to add?
Nope, I thought I put my hand down.
Good enough. Thanks, Alyssa, for pointing that out.
Just checking, 14 months on Zoom, and I just learned how to do that last week. First of all, I appreciate this conversation a lot. I pride myself on being a 7th generation Vermonter, on our son being an 8th generation Vermonter. And it wasn't until this last year at 48 that I ever considered who my family displaced when they came here. And I think I am trying to understand how the philosophy of growing up in the North has influenced my understanding of my role and responsibility in colonization and in white privilege and financial gain on the backs of other people. And it has me thinking again about a class I took years ago now in seminary about mission. And I wonder if there isn't also a place and a time in these conversations to understand some of how we got here by understanding some of our congregational ancestors who did an enormous amount of harm in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of places in the world, through what they understood as this calling to make disciples of all nations, whether they wanted to be or not. So I guess I just offer that out to you to say that the understanding of white privilege as it's impacting life right now is so important. And some of this stuff has been handed down to us, as we've been talking in the chat, historically, through what we understand to be this faith in which many of us take so much pride and joy. But there's some work there to uncover what the history actually is. And on a related note, I'm trying to understand why, and this is maybe a whole separate conversation, why reparations are seen as such an affront. Had a conversation with a congregant about 3 weeks ago in the middle of an Everyone Eats distribution who would consider herself to be, someone who's pretty well educated and has lived outside of the state and has worked with people of different ethnicities and races. And boy, did she have a lot to say about reparations and why that was a terrible idea. And yet in this litigious society in which we live, reparations are a huge part of why the justice system exists at all. So at some point, I'd love to figure out with you all how to help people understand that differently.
Thank you. Alyssa, May, if you would put that in the chat, because as we look forward, as the Racial Justice Task Force looks forward to making some plans for more conference-wide education, that might be a subject matter that we could look at more closely. So thank you. I see Ed and then Nancy.
So yeah, I'm just, I apologize. I'm hearing bits and pieces. So if this has already been said or noted, please pardon me. I'm
the church thing,
listening to the doctrine of discovery, and remembering if you've read Isabella Wilkerson's Cast, just the simple plain truth of it is that slavery does not happen in this country without the explicit approval of the church. If the church does not say 400 years ago that slavery is okay, some other history would have happened. It would be different. It doesn't happen without our spiritual forebears saying it was going to be okay. It just doesn't. So yeah, but then the other thing with climate change, we know, and we've experienced it this year in a sense. We know that people of color and poor white people are the least able and will be the most impacted by the climate as it continues to change. We've watched that in Vermont this year as people have purchased houses sight unseen in order to flee from the pandemic. And for us to ignore climate change is one of the grossest exhibitions of our white privilege, because we're just going to wait until it does change, and then we'll use our privilege and our resources that others don't have to move somewhere else and go on living there. And with regard to Alyssa and reparations, as a very important discussion we need to have, but we always need to remember that reparations have already been made. That when in the aftermath of the Civil War, we did make reparations to the slave owners for the property that they lost as a result of emancipation. We paid them, but the debt is still owed on all that labor and other things. So great to see you folks. It's almost as good as being in person.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for your thoughts. Wendy, I see that your hand is up, but I'm thinking that maybe you just didn't lower it. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, somebody came in the door and I had to leave. I wanted to back up and talk about church support. We have a church youth group, and within our church youth group is a young teenager whose family are here, 3 children from Mexico. And he has been going to the local school and was the victim of bullying and abuse, and his parents had been and tried to sort it out for him. And eventually the kids at youth group found out, and they were furious. They said to him, "We are your friends. You know we are your friends. Why did you not tell us? Why did you not tell us what was going on? We would have supported you." And so I just would tell you that story to say, church youth groups can be a wonderful place for kids in small groups to support each other when there is racial abuse of any kind. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. Nancy, you've been so patient. What do you have for us today?
I just wanted to share that the Middlebury Church did a month-long group class on the book Dear Church by Larry Duncan, a Black minister writing to the whitest denomination in the US. And at the end of it, just like you mentioned, when it got to the point of, okay, what do we do now? It kind of goes quiet. Everybody wants to do something, but you're really not sure what to do. And like Kurt talked about, there's so many different avenues. We have a green team that's doing their things. We're in a pandemic right now, as everybody knows. So the church, the group was about 25 or 30 that met every week by Zoom. We decided that what we really needed to do was to make sure that our congregation was all on the same wavelength. That we need to be united in what we're going to proclaim that we stand for and what we're going to do. And that we need to know what some of these words mean. Like what do we mean when we say racist? What are racist words? And reparations, what does that mean to people? Because we found in our little group of 30, it meant a lot of different things. So before we go start talking as a united front, we needed to make sure we were united in the beginning. But we also are very aware that after being separated for such a long time, that there's going to be some healing, grieving, and rejoicing when we all get back together again, hopefully by this fall. And there's going to be a lot of emotions already that we're dealing with. So I don't think it's not a simple little thing to just decide one day, okay, we're going to start doing this. We did have a part of the group that says, oh, we can't just stand around and do nothing anymore. And we agreed to that, and we agreed that we're a very socially minded church to begin with, and that we really believe that we are not meaning to be racist in any way, shape, or form. But we need to decide what that really means first before we can move on. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Nancy. And I think you do point to several important things, but one is even something as basic as definitions, right? What are we talking about? When we say white supremacy, what do we mean? What are we referring to as a baseline so that we can all have a conversation and understand each other? Chris, I see your hand is up again.
Yeah, there's been a lot of mentioning of this issue in our churches in the chat. I serve a church right now with beautiful, beautiful stained glass windows, and yet all of the depictions of Jesus and the holy are all very, very white people.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my favorite stories of my experience is I was serving a church, and of course we had a print of the very famous image of Jesus that we're all familiar of. I think it's called the Malman Jesus, and you'd recognize it if you saw it. And I was standing there talking with a woman who was filling in as our organist, because our regular organist was a snowbird and this woman was going to play organ. for the winner. And she saw the image of Jesus and she said, "Oh, that's my grandfather." And I said, "What?" She said, I said, "You know, what do you mean that's your grandfather?" And she said that my grandfather was the model for that picture, that painting of Jesus. And it's one of the most ubiquitous images of Jesus in our society is her grandfather. So we have these images of who Jesus was / is in our life that reflect our own heritage and cover up things about our own heritage that if it were Black, it would reveal about ourselves. And we need to be cognizant, aware, and honest about that very thing. Is we've co-opted the image of the divine.
Yes, thank you, Chris. That's really powerful. Another really powerful statement. And I'm guessing, although I'm not sure, that most people have seen the image Jesus of the People by Vermont artist Janet Mckenzie. If people aren't familiar with that image, you should look it up. Janet Mckenzie is the artist. She's Vermont based. And the piece is called Jesus of the People. And this image was created, it was a competition to imagine the divine, imagine Jesus. And she won this competition, but got a lot of grief because the person that she used as a model was a woman and a person of color. So I invite you to look at that image as a more inclusive way and probably far more historically accurate way of depicting Jesus, but speaks exactly to what you were talking about, Chris, for sure. I see somebody put a link to it. Thank you, Deborah, in the chat. So you can jump right on and take a peek at that image. It's beautiful. So let's see, I'm just going to do a time check here. We're at 2:40. We have about 20 minutes left if we so choose to use them. I'm going to just for a second take us back to what originally got the conversation started, which was about sharing resources. And I see a lot of books coming through. I see some workshops. Also, like, really invite you to expand that even further. Is there a piece of music that you've heard that has helped open a door for you around this that hadn't been open before, or brought it to a deeper place? I know for me personally, music is such an important part of my life that it is not uncommon for me to take things in on a different level when I hear a piece of music. So music, art, some kind of performance, poetry. Is there a person you're following? Those of us who might use social media, is there somebody that you're following who has who posts things that kind of give you aha moments or help to open up the ways you're thinking about this? So I encourage you to define resources as broadly as you possibly can. Books are great, but there's lots of other ways to kind of dig in and access this information. So before we go, be thinking about that too. I don't see any new hands up. Is there anything anybody would like to add? Yeah, I see Facebook groups coming up. Yes, Facebook groups are great. Movies, yes. So I'll just invite people to continue to put things in the chat. And if there are no other burning questions, statements, and please, again, also, if you had a question that you posed to the group, I invite you to put that in the chat so that we can take that back to the Racial Justice Task Force and perhaps look at bringing somebody in to address one of the various questions that we had come up. Okay, I am going to just kind of officially close us, but we can leave this open. And again, invite you to keep adding stuff, and I will make sure that I save the chat. So I want to just close us with a prayer, because we are church, right? And we do pray. So I have a prayer here that was written by the Reverend Dr. Sharon Fenema. And she wrote it on the first anniversary of Michael Brown's death. And it's actually a charge. So I'm going to leave you with this. When racism goes unchecked, unacknowledged, unrecognized, we will shut it down. Until Black Lives Matter is in all our communities, in every place, we will shut it down. When the beloved community is violated by violence and abuse of power, we will shut it down. Until the hope of a new day of freedom is made real in our midst, we will shut it down. If we hear our siblings, our kindred, and communities crying out, "I can't breathe," then we must stay in the struggle. We cannot leave. Through God's grace and God's love, with God's help, we're not going to stop until the people are free. Go into the world to fight for freedom. Go into our communities to struggle for justice. Go into the streets to work in solidarity. Go into the boardrooms, in courtrooms, police stations, and council meetings to make a way out of no way. Go into each endeavor to love one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. Amen. Thank you all for being here. Keep filling up that chat.
Can you remind us how to save the chat for all of those?
Yes, if you wanted to save the chat yourself, if you go down to where you would be typing in, and you'll see a file to the right and then 3 dots. If you click on those 3 dots, it'll say save chat. Are you on an iPad by any chance?
Yes.
Okay. Do I have any iPad users out there who've saved chats before who can help Julie out?
To my knowledge, it cannot be done on iPad.
Okay.
Thank you.
kidding.
Maybe that there's some way, but to my knowledge, it cannot be saved on an iPad.
Again, they're being discriminated against.
I think it's Apple who sets themselves apart.
No. Wait, Apple talks with PCs. PCs don't talk with Apple.
No.
Well, I can open PC documents on my Apple, but I can't send Apple documents to some people with PCs.
Yeah.
Julie, send an email. Julie, send an email to the conference and I can send you out the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll make sure we save it. Get it out. Thank you all for being here. And I have a little bit of a break, but I believe that this is the Zoom room that will be open for peacemakers. So if you want to go on a bit of a break, just shut off your camera and then be back at 3:30. Thank you all.
Elise?
Yes.
I think I've only been to one Vermont conference annual meeting before. Can you just remind ignoramuses like myself what peacemakers is? I hear it referred to all the time, and I suspect it's something that almost everybody knows but me.
Come, Scott, come and find out.
Oh, I certainly will.
It's really one of the most inspiring things of annual meetings.
Is this thing where everybody went to like in a room at a certain time? It was usually after, and we heard from organizations speak at a microphone?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And it's very
I'm
inspirational.
What it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've only been to one, but I liked it.
Yeah.
And just a reminder, friends, that this year, you don't have to miss anything to go to it. So unfortunately, sometimes peacemakers, you might have something else. And because we have ample breaks today, I'd highly encourage everyone to go to Peacemakers. It has a fine name, but really it's just what everyone else is doing that maybe we can copy for our church or learn from or help inform. So please come if you can.
Thank you.
Great,
Thanks for
thanks.
asking, Scott, and thanks for the PSAs, Chris and Jeremy. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the wonderful job you've done, Elisa.
Oh,
That was good.
I'm just really grateful to have an opportunity for us to all be together and talk about something that's so darn important. So saving this chat, it's going back to racial justice, and we're going to see what we can do about getting some more things on the books as a conference.
Thank you.